The night was unnaturally still. The kind of silence that settles over the world after hours of activity, like everything is holding its breath. I had just returned home from a late meeting, the kind that stretches on endlessly until your energy is drained and your mind is too tired to focus. When I walked through the door, the house felt empty, quiet in a way that didn't sit well with me. I thought about it for a moment. Maybe it was the darkness or the loneliness that had started to creep in after the move. I hadn't been living here long, just a couple of weeks. It should have been a fresh start, but something about this house made me uneasy. The creaking floorboards, the strange way the wind howled through the gaps in the windows. It all added up. I brushed it off though. You're supposed to feel a little unsettled when you move into a new place, right? I tossed my keys onto the counter and collapsed onto the couch, rubbing my eyes. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, the sound so loud in the silence it was almost painful. 12:03 a.m. The light from the street lamps outside cast faint shadows across the room, elongating and twisting with the subtle sway of the curtains. I tried to shake the feeling of dread that lingered. Maybe I was just overturned, but it felt more than that. More like I was being watched. I chalked it up to the stress. Stress can do strange things to your mind after all. Then, the phone rang. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. I hadn't heard the phone ring in days. I didn't know why, but the silence made the sound so much more noticeable. I jumped slightly. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to shatter the stillness, like the sudden snap of a twig in an empty forest. The phone sat on the kitchen counter, its soft blue screen glowing eerily in the dim room. Who would be calling at this hour? I tried to ignore it. Whoever it was, they'd leave a voicemail, right? But the ringing continued, sharp and persistent. With a sigh, I pushed myself up from the couch and walked toward the kitchen. The old hardwood creaked under my feet. My mind raced. It couldn't be a telemarketer. Those calls had stopped after I changed my number last month. So who? The ringing grew louder with each step, almost as if it was trying to drag me closer. I reached the phone and glanced at the screen, but there was no caller ID. Just an anonymous number flashing back at me. The uncertainty gnawed at my nerves, and I hesitated. Should I answer it? I had a bad feeling. The kind you get when something is just a little too wrong, but you don't know why. But curiosity won out. I picked up the receiver, the cold plastic chilling my fingers. Hello. For a moment, there was nothing. Just static. Deep, crackling, and endless. Hello. I repeated, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive quiet of the house. Who's there? A low, rasping breath echoed from the other end, followed by a voice. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't even a voice that sounded entirely human. Come home. The words were slow, deliberate. Each one seemed to hang in the air like a heavy weight. I felt the blood drain from my face, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was distorted, muffled by static, but it sent a chill crawling down my spine. I glanced around the kitchen, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows. But the room was empty. The voice again, this time more urgent. Come home. I felt sick. My breath quickened, shallow and erratic. Who is this? I demanded, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound firm. My mind raced, trying to figure out if I knew the caller, if this was some kind of prank. But the longer the voice held on, the less it seemed like a prank. It was cold, detached, and that terrified me. The line crackled again. Static filled the gaps between breaths, and then, just before I could speak again, it happened. The voice, clear and unmistakable, whispered in a tone that chilled me to the bone. You don't remember, do you? The words hit me like a slap. My pulse skyrocketed. What was this? Some twisted game? But before I could say anything, there was a long, drawn-out sigh. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart thumping in my chest like a hammer. I should have hung up. I should have thrown the phone across the room and locked the doors. But I couldn't. Something held me there, frozen in place. Who was that? What did they mean? Come home. The words echoed in my head, over and over. I paced the kitchen, my mind scrambling for answers, but nothing made sense. I lived alone. I hadn't spoken to anyone from my past in months, so who could have known? I set the phone down, the silence swallowing me whole. I didn't want to make a call. I didn't want to risk hearing that voice again. But I needed answers. I needed to know what the hell was happening. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair and quickly shoved my phone into my pocket. There was a sense of urgency now, something tugging at the edges of my mind, telling me I couldn't wait any longer. I had to leave. Had to get out of that house. The front door opened with a creak, and I stepped out into the cold night air, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But as I stepped onto the porch, something caught my eye. Just a flicker. A shadow moving across the lawn. I turned around, heart thudding against my ribcage, but the street was empty. Only the faint glow of the street lamp, casting long shadows across the pavement. I closed the door behind me and stepped off the porch, the cold biting into my skin. There was nothing left to do but wait. Wait for the next call, and the next, and the next. I didn't know it yet, but that phone call was just the beginning. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The voice, the words, they haunted me long after the phone call ended. And the longer I tried to push it out of my mind, the more it gnawed at me. The voice had been so clear, so chilling. Come home. It wasn't the kind of phrase that leaves a person alone. It burrows itself into your thoughts like an unwanted seed, taking root and sprouting in the darkest corners of your mind. What did it mean? Who was it from? And why now? The questions twisted and turned in my head, all leading back to one thing. I wasn't going to be able to rest until I found out. I thought about calling the police again, but I knew they would brush it off. The officers had already dismissed my earlier concerns. Just a prank, they said, with the same condescending tone they reserved for someone who was obviously overreacting. But this wasn't a prank. It couldn't be. I paced the house in the dead of night, my feet making soft, deliberate thumps on the hardwood floor. The clock ticked louder than it had any right to. 12:03 a.m. again. I glanced at the phone on the counter. I had to know if it would ring again, if that voice would come back. But I couldn't bring myself to pick it up. The thought of hearing that same distorted whisper again sent a cold rush of fear through me. Still, the longer I stood there, the more the silence in the room suffocated me. I was stuck in a loop, frozen between the desire to hear more and the terror that came with it. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but when the phone rang again, I felt a strange sense of relief. Almost like the darkness inside me had found its way to the light. It wasn't until I reached for the receiver that I realized just how much I had been dreading this moment. The ringing stopped. I picked up the phone, my breath shallow, trying to steady myself. Hello. My voice was barely above a whisper. The static crackled before the voice came through, just as it had before. But this time it was clearer, too clear. Like someone was standing right behind me. You should have listened. My heart skipped a beat. The words weren't an invitation anymore. They were a command, a chilling reminder that I had done something wrong. Something I hadn't even realized. I glanced at the phone, a cold sweat trickling down the back of my neck. There was something about this voice, something familiar, like it should be someone I knew. But the distortion, the static, it masked everything, turning it into an enigma I couldn't solve. Who are you? I asked again, my voice shaking. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the whisper again, like it was coming from inside my own head. Don't you remember? I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the phone against the wall and run as far away from this place as I could. But I stood frozen, every muscle in my body locked in place. The voice seemed to draw closer, like it was in the room with me, its breath warm against my ear. The words were so intimate, so personal, that they felt like a secret I was supposed to remember but couldn't. "You don't remember me, do you?" The voice grew more insistent. "You left me here." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My breath caught in my throat. What was this? What had I done? The house felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing down, making it harder to breathe. My thoughts began to spiral. Had I been involved in something terrible in my past? Something I had buried so deep I couldn't even recall it. Was this voice someone I had wronged? Someone I had forgotten? The line went silent, and I waited, heart thudding against my ribcage. Then, before I could even react, the voice returned. This time, there was no static, no crackling interference. Just the voice. Calm, clear, unmistakable. "You should have come home when I asked." The words hung in the air, making my skin crawl. Who was this person? What did they want from me? The last time I had heard those words, I had been a child. I had forgotten them. I had forgotten everything. I felt sick to my stomach. The pieces of a broken memory were beginning to fall into place. A memory that had been locked away for years, buried beneath the weight of time and fear. But it wasn't enough. I couldn't remember. Not clearly. I set the phone down, my hands trembling. What was I supposed to do with this? I had to know more. I had to understand what was happening, why this voice was tormenting me. I tried to push the panic aside, but it was no use. The feeling of being watched had returned. It wasn't just in my head. There was something out there, something I couldn't see but could feel in my bones. It was too much. I couldn't stay here, not with this constant pressure building in my chest, not with the fear creeping through every shadow, every crack in the wall. I stood up and grabbed my jacket. The cold night air might have offered some relief, but it was just an excuse to escape the suffocating claustrophobia of the house. I had to leave. But as soon as I stepped outside, the weight of the silence followed me. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The street was empty, the same as it had been before. But the quiet felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, as though the world itself was waiting for something. And then, the phone rang again. I didn't even hesitate. I sprinted back into the house and grabbed it off the counter. "Hello?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "Who are you?" The line was silent for a moment, and then it came, the whisper. The same voice, the same chilling tone. "Come home," it said again, but this time it wasn't just a command. It was a warning. I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. I wanted to hang up, throw the phone out the window, lock every door, and never look back. But it was too late. The game had already begun. It's strange how, after a while, you start to question what's real. The world around you, the things you thought you knew, all begin to blur into something else. Something darker. After that last phone call, I couldn't sleep. Not a single minute. My mind wouldn't quiet down, spinning in circles, trying to make sense of what had happened. The words, the voice, they wouldn't let me go. "Come home." It echoed over and over, like a chant ringing in my ears. I thought I'd go mad if I didn't figure this out. I had to know what was happening, why I was being pulled into this nightmare. So I started digging. I went through every box I hadn't unpacked yet, searching for something, anything, that might explain what the hell was going on. Old photos, letters, papers I hadn't looked at in years. Anything that could make sense of the vague memories swirling in my head, the ones that felt like they belonged to someone else. And that's when I found it. A yellowed envelope. It had been buried deep at the bottom of a box, like it was trying to hide from me. My heart jumped when I saw the handwriting on the front. It was unmistakable. It was my mother's. But that wasn't possible. She'd been gone for years. There was no way this could be from her. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a letter. One that looked like it had been written only days ago, even though it had been sitting there untouched for longer than I could remember. The words were simple, but they hit me like a ton of bricks. You don't remember, do you? You were just a child when we left, but I'm still here. I'm still waiting. Come home, and all will be forgiven. But if you don't, I'll make sure you never forget. I stood there, holding the letter, feeling the air around me grow colder by the second. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. My mother. How was this possible? This letter. It didn't make any sense. And then, just as I was about to crumble the paper in my fist, I remembered the phone call. The voice. You don't remember me, do you? The words haunted me, and now I knew why. This wasn't a random caller. This was someone who knew me, someone who knew my past, my deepest fears. I sank down onto the floor, the weight of the letter pressing down on my chest like an anchor. How had I forgotten? Why had I buried all of this? My mother's voice, the one I had thought I'd never hear again, was still in my mind, echoing with every word she had written. Come home, the voice had said. But now, reading her words, I wasn't so sure anymore. Was it a warning or a plea? And then I realized something else. The house I was living in, the one I had moved into after everything fell apart. It wasn't a random choice. It wasn't just a place to escape to. It was the same house my family had lived in when I was young. The one I had fled from. The place where my life had shattered. That's when everything clicked. The voice. The letter. The unsettling feeling that had settled in my stomach ever since I moved back in. I wasn't just haunted by my past. I was being drawn back to it. Pulled into the very place I had tried to forget. I stood up. The letter still clutched in my hand. There was no denying it now. I had to face whatever had been waiting for me. I had to go back. But as I walked to the door, something stopped me. A sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, just a faint creak in the floorboards, a slight rustle of leaves outside. But it wasn't. It was a voice. Soft at first, like it was coming from far away. And then, it grew louder. Come home. My blood ran cold. I dropped the letter and ran to the front door. But when I pulled it open, there was no one there. Nothing but the darkness. The same empty street I had seen 100 times before. Yet somehow, this time, it felt different. The night air wasn't just cold, it was suffocating. The silence felt oppressive, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. And then, the phone rang again. I couldn't ignore it this time. I had to know. I had to hear that voice again, even though every instinct in me screamed to stay away. I ran inside and grabbed the receiver. Who are you? I demanded, my voice trembling. But there was no answer, just a low hum of static. Then, slowly, the voice came through. Come home. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. This wasn't just some prank anymore. This wasn't just some twisted game. Whoever was behind this knew me, knew my past, and they were getting closer. I had to make a choice. The weight of the decision pressed down on me. Go home. Face whatever had been waiting there all these years. Or run. Run far away and never look back. But as I stood in that dark room, I knew the answer. There was no running. There was no escaping. I had to go home. The decision had been made, though I didn't feel the rush of relief I'd expected. It was more like an eerie sense of inevitability, as though I had been walking toward this moment for years, blindfolded, and now I was just taking off the mask. I had to go back to the place I had spent my childhood, the house I had left behind when things had gone wrong. The house that had been the site of so many broken memories. The night air seemed even colder as I stood at the edge of the property, looking up at the house. The old oak tree in the yard, the cracked porch steps, the peeling paint on the front door, it was all the same. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. The house loomed over me like a silent sentinel, watching, waiting. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, to flee this place before I uncovered something I couldn't handle. But the voice I'd heard over the phone, in my dreams, in my thoughts, had pulled me here. It had forced my hand, and now there was no turning back. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The gravel crunched beneath my feet, each step feeling heavier than the last. The porch light flickered above me, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. I reached the door, and for a moment, I hesitated. Then, without another thought, I pushed it open. The smell of dust and stale air hit me instantly, a scent I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The house had been empty for years, but it felt alive. The air was thick with memories, with things I had tried so hard to forget. But now, they came rushing back, filling the space around me like a storm. The hallway stretched out in front of me, the same worn carpet, the same cracked wallpaper. Everything was familiar, but there was something else now. A presence. Something that didn't belong. "Come home," the voice whispered again, only now it felt closer, as if it were standing right next to me. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The voice wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was here, in the house. It was part of this place now, woven into the walls, the floors, the very air I breathed. I took another step inside, my mind racing. I had to find out what this was, who this was. The living room was just as I remembered, though dust had settled on the furniture, thick layers that hadn't been disturbed in years. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked, its hands frozen at 12:03. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. The time. It was the same time as when the phone calls had come. The same time when the voice had first whispered in my ear. I had to find the source. I had to know what was happening. I made my way down the hallway, my feet barely making a sound. Each room I passed seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something. For me. At the end of the hall was the door to the basement. It was always locked when I was a child, but tonight it stood wide open, the shadows spilling out like an invitation to a place I'd always feared. I reached the door, my fingers trembling as I gripped the handle. The moment I touched it, a rush of memories hit me. My mother's voice, calling me from the basement when I was young, telling me everything was fine, but I knew better. I knew what had really been down there. I had never gone inside, but I had heard the sounds. Strange noises, scratching, whispering, like something or someone was trapped. Or like something had been buried. The thought made my stomach churn, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I stepped inside. The basement was darker than I remembered, the air damp and heavy with the scent of mildew. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, and the dim light from the small window at the top of the stairs barely illuminated the space around me. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. This was it. This was where everything had started. The memories, the whispers, the voice. At the far end of the basement, something caught my eye. A glimmer of light, soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I moved toward it, my heart hammering in my chest. As I got closer, I saw it. A small wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox, sitting on a shelf. The box was old, the wood scratched and faded. But what struck me was the symbol carved into the lid, a symbol I recognized. It was the same one that had been in my mother's old journals, the ones I'd found when I was a teenager, before everything had fallen apart. I reached for the box, my hands shaking as I lifted it down. The moment my fingers brushed against the surface, a cold jolt ran through me, like electricity shooting through my veins. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. I opened the box. Inside was a small photograph, faded with age. It showed a family, my family, but there was something wrong about it. The smiles on their faces were too wide, too forced, like they were hiding something. And behind them, in the shadows, was a figure I didn't recognize. A man, standing just out of focus, his face barely visible, but there was something about his presence that felt wrong. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the photograph. It was like it was pulling me in, like it was showing me something I wasn't supposed to see. And then, just as I was about to put it down, the phone rang. The sound cut through the silence of the basement, sharp and sudden, and my heart leaped into my throat. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't want to hear that voice again, but I had no choice. I ran upstairs, the photograph still clutched in my hand. The phone was on the counter, its screen flashing with an unknown number. I picked it up, holding it to my ear. "Hello?" I asked, my voice cracking. The static came first, followed by the voice. "Come home." I felt the blood drain from my face. And then, the voice whispered, as though it had been waiting for this moment. "It's time to face what you've been running from."